Imagine you're trying to steer a lifeboat, and it's actively taking on water.
Right, a terrifying situation to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. But meanwhile, there are like 15,000 of your passengers out on the deck, and they're desperately trying to throw other people overboard just to keep the vessel afloat.
Wow.
So just 3 days ago, the South African government basically had to spend 600 million rand in a single 24-hour period just to keep that lifeboat from capsizing entirely.
And the really wild thing there is that 600 million rand, it wasn't spent on fixing the actual leak.
Right.
It was spent entirely on riot police, on intelligence gathering, containment. I mean, it was a massive, incredibly expensive tourniquet applied to a wound that has, been bleeding for decades at this point.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Friday, July 3rd, 2026. And just 3 days ago, on Tuesday, June 30th, South Africa witnessed these massive, highly coordinated demonstrations across all its major cities.
Yeah, if you caught any headlines this week, you probably saw the images, right? The crowds in the streets, the heavy police cordons.
Exactly. But today, we're looking at a stack of sources, primarily a really deep analytical piece from CAAS, that's the Center for AI and Sustainable Development.
Yeah.
And they look past all the tear gas and the barricades to analyze the actual mechanics of what happened.
Which is so necessary right now.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this severe tension between legitimate economic grievances and basic human rights. We're going to explore how local frustrations in South African neighborhoods are actively sending these diplomatic shockwaves across the entire African continent.
Yeah, and to really understand what materialized on Tuesday, we have to kind of isolate the noise of that street-level vigilantism from the very real, very structural failures of a post-apartheid economy.
Right, because the surface events are dramatic, obviously.
Very dramatic. But the underlying constitutional and economic engine driving those events, that's what really demands our attention today.
So let's start by looking at the sheer scale of Tuesday's operation. Because these were coordinated anti-undocumented immigration marches. We saw significant crowds in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town. But the absolute epicenter was Durban. I mean, you had over 15,000 participants gathered in that city alone.
And the organization behind those numbers is crucial to understand. Like, these weren't just spontaneous flash mobs, right?
Right, they didn't just happen out of nowhere.
Exactly. You had groups operating under banners like March and March, working alongside movements that are linked to Operation Doodla.
And for those who might be unfamiliar with the context, Operation Doodla is this localized civic movement that is increasingly taken on basically a vigilante-style approach.
Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. They specifically target undocumented migrants. They publicly blame them for the country's high crime rates and the lack of jobs.
And these groups did something highly provocative leading up to this. They set this unofficial, very public deadline for undocumented foreigners to leave the country. And that deadline was Tuesday, June 30th.
Which is just, when a civilian group sets an unofficial deadline for mass deportation, you are practically begging for a violent collision.
Absolutely. Everyone in the region was just holding their breath. But the CISD report highlights this statistical reality about the fallout that completely defies what you'd expect.
Yeah, the numbers are really surprising.
Right. Out of 120 reported marches nationwide on Tuesday, 108 of them were completely peaceful.
Which means the containment strategy actually worked for the vast majority of the country.
Yeah. But we still saw 12 marches where the situation deteriorated, where it required active police intervention.
Right. In places like Soweto and Tembisa, crowds were targeting local shops. In Hammersdale, there was an incident where a local tuck shop, which is like a small, informal convenience store, that was looted.
Yeah, you had sporadic stone throwing, localized property destruction, and by the end of the day, authorities had made over 900 arrests nationwide, mostly related to public violence and looting.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. 900 arrests in a single day.
It's a staggering logistical burden for any justice system. I mean, it means 900 bookings, 900 holding cells, 900 separate legal proceedings.
It requires a wartime level of coordination from domestic security. The government literally canceled all police leave in the days prior.
Wow.
Yeah, they deployed this specialized multi-agency operation that, as you mentioned earlier, cost the state roughly 600 million rand.
So the government spent 600 million rand just to keep the peace for one single day. That's a massive Band-Aid.
It is, but that price tag really has to be weighed against historical precedent. Like in 2008, unchecked xenophobic violence left 62 people dead.
God.
And during the catastrophic civil unrest in July 2021, over 350 people lost their lives. So when you place Tuesday's events against that specific historical backdrop, the state's institutional capacity to prevent mass casualties showed a remarkable, quantifiable improvement.
That's a really fair point. But still, you can throw 600 million rand at a Tuesday to stop a riot. You can lock down a highway. You can secure a shopping mall. But a police cordon cannot arrest a collapsing economy. Once the sun comes up on Wednesday and the police go home, the underlying math of these people's daily lives hasn't changed at all. To understand why 15,000 people felt compelled to march in Durban, we really have to look at the structural desperation that's pushing them into the streets.
And the CISD report draws a very strict line here, which is a really necessary one. We have to examine the economic desperation driving the protests without validating or excusing the xenophobic actions that resulted from them.
Right. It's entirely possible to impartially report on the severe frustrations of the citizenry while simultaneously recognizing the devastating human impact these marches have on migrant populations.
Exactly. And the numbers behind that citizen frustration are, frankly, terrifying. South Africa is currently staggering under an unemployment rate of 32 to 34%.
That is just, that's one of the highest formal unemployment rates anywhere on the planet.
It is. And when you combine that 34% unemployment with generations of systemic inequality, you get public services that are just strained to the absolute breaking point.
We're talking chronic housing shortages, right?
Yeah. Healthcare facilities that simply cannot accommodate the sheer volume of patients, and an education system buckling under a severe lack of resources.
So when a citizen is living inside that reality, when they can't get a job, can't get a hospital bed, can't get affordable housing, they naturally look for the variable that is breaking the system.
Right. Human nature is to find a cause.
Exactly. And the prevailing perception on the street is that undocumented migration is that variable. There's this intense belief that an unchecked influx of foreign nationals is overloading those crumbling services and creating impossible job competition, especially in the informal cash-in-hand sector.
And that citizen frustration, it's not occurring in a vacuum. The government has actually been attempting to relieve that pressure valve. Just in the first 6 months of this year, from January to June 2026, South African authorities arrested approximately 50,000 undocumented migrants.
50,000 in 6 months.
Yeah, and they've already repatriated around 25,000 of them.
Wait, so if the government is already actively arresting and deporting tens of thousands of people, why did 15,000 citizens still feel the need to march in Durban?
Well, clearly that massive enforcement effort didn't actually alleviate the tension on the ground.
Which brings us right back to that lifeboat analogy. It's like being trapped on a lifeboat that's taking on water. People aren't necessarily angry at the other passengers originally, they are just terrified of sinking.
Right.
But instead of fixing the leak, the frustration gets directed at whoever just climbed aboard.
And the human toll of that directed terror is catastrophic. Because of that June 30th deadline manufactured by the vigilante groups, thousands of African migrants, primarily from neighboring states, they didn't wait around to see what would happen. They fled preemptively out of pure fear for their lives.
And when a massive chunk of your informal workforce and small business owners suddenly pack up and flee, the local economy takes an immediate hit.
Oh, absolutely. Businesses shutter. The local suppliers who sold goods to those migrant-owned shops suddenly lose their revenue.
The local landlords lose their rent.
Exactly. The economic situation actually worsens for the very citizens who stayed behind. And, the fear driving that exodus was grounded in reality. In the weeks leading up to June 30th, there were already isolated fatalities, including the deaths of Mozambican nationals due to vigilante violence.
It's so tragic. So the state finds itself forced to condemn the vigilantism, manage the humanitarian fallout, and somehow simultaneously address the migration crisis. When a nation is in a lifeboat scenario with scarce resources, the fundamental question becomes, who decides? Who gets a seat on the boat?
And that legal authority brings us directly to the South African Constitution, which, by the way, is universally regarded as one of the most progressive, deeply inclusive founding documents in the world.
But right now, it feels like that inclusivity is acting as a massive pressure test for the entire state apparatus.
It really is. The foundational ethos is established in the very first lines. The preamble famously declares, "We, the people of South Africa, believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity."
Notice the phrasing there. It does not say it belongs to all citizens. It explicitly says all who live in it.
Exactly. And that isn't just poetic language, right? It is codified law. Chapter 2 is the Bill of Rights, and the vast majority of its protections apply universally to everyone physically inside the country's borders.
The CASD report zeroes in on two specific protections here. Section 12 guarantees freedom and security of the person, meaning you have a right to be free from all forms of violence from either public or private sources. And Section 21 guarantees freedom of movement. These are the constitutional shields designed to protect any migrant, documented or otherwise, from vigilante mobs.
However, a constitution is a framework for governance. It's not a blank check. It does demarcate very specific privileges reserved exclusively for citizens.
Okay.
While Section 19 strictly limits the right to vote to citizens, citizens are also prioritized for certain socio-economic benefits, state resources, and naturally they have absolute rights regarding entry and permanent residence that foreign nationals simply do not possess.
And complicating Tuesday's events even further is Section 17, which guarantees the right to assemble, to demonstrate, and to present petitions, provided it's peaceful and unarmed.
Right. So the government couldn't just preemptively ban the June 30th marches because the Regulation of Gatherings Act legally protects the citizens' right to protest their economic conditions.
So you're looking at a government trapped in a legal and moral paradox.
Completely. On the enforcement side, the institutions executed their mandate on June 30th. They allowed the constitutional right to assembly, they contained the violent elements, and they protected the physical security of migrants.
But critics point out that successfully policing a protest is just reactive containment. Where the state is failing is in proactive governance. What does proactive failure actually look like in this context?
It looks like highly porous borders. It looks like systemic corruption within the departments responsible for processing visas and asylum claims.
Wow, yeah.
It looks like a widespread failure to deliver basic municipal services. When proactive governance collapses, it creates massive enforcement gaps in everyday life. Those gaps breed scarcity, and scarcity breeds the exact kind of intercommunity conflict we saw on Tuesday.
Wait, so if you are a listener trying to make sense of this, there is an inherent contradiction here. The Constitution explicitly dictates an open-armed philosophy. The country belongs to all who live in it.
Right.
But practically speaking, amidst severe scarcity and 34% unemployment, the government still has to prioritize citizens. How can any government successfully balance an open-armed philosophy with a closed-wallet reality?
The really uncomfortable truth is that in moments of extreme economic contraction, a perfect balance might just be impossible. The Constitution provides the ideal, sure, but political survival dictates the reality.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The state is legally obligated to protect the migrant from violence, but it is equally obligated to answer to a starving electorate that is aggressively demanding closed borders.
And this entire domestic balancing act isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
South Africa's internal struggles are actively colliding with the grand vision of a united African economy.
Absolutely. What happens in a Durban township sends immediate shockwaves to boardrooms in Abuja and Nairobi. We have to view this through the lens of regional and continental integration because South Africa is a foundational pillar of that entire project.
The CALSD report highlights this massive gap between local realities and international agreements. Let's look at the regional level first.
Yeah.
You have SADC, the Southern African Development Community. They have a labor migration policy framework established back in 2014, and that's backed by action plans running through 2025.
And it is so vital to clarify what that SADC framework actually entails because it's often misrepresented in the media.
Also,
The framework champions manage labor migration. The goal is to facilitate skills matching and cross-border economic cooperation. It does not advocate for unregulated open borders.
I see.
South Africa is committed to orderly migration within the SADC region, but it fully retains its sovereign right to control its territorial integrity.
But when you zoom out to the continental level, the ambitions get much, much bigger. The African Union is driving the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Right. Huge initiative.
Yeah, it's monumental. It aims to create a single, borderless market for goods and services across all 54 nations, theoretically supported by an AU free movement protocol.
And the backlash from the June 30th protests has severely tested those exact continental ambitions. Following the marches, we saw immediate diplomatic fallout. Major economic partners like Nigeria and Ghana summoned diplomats to demand answers.
The travel advisories were being debated, right?
Exactly. And there is a rapidly growing fear across the continent of Afrophobia, which is this specific hostility directed toward other African nationals.
Former South African President Thabo Mbeki has been incredibly vocal about this dynamic. He doesn't just view these protests as local riots over missing jobs. He frames this rising tide of vigilantism as a fundamental attack on the very concept of African unity.
His perspective really cuts to the core of the friction here, because the AfCFTA requires the physical movement of people to function.
Right, you can't just move goods with no people.
Exactly. You cannot have a unified free trade zone if cross-border traders, logistics drivers, investors, and seasonal laborers cannot safely transit between nations. If the physical bodies facilitating the trade are under constant threat of vigilante violence, the economic treaties are essentially just worthless paper.
If the African Union is pushing for a borderless economic market, but the continent's most industrialized nation is practically barricading its doors because it can't handle the influx, doesn't that entirely derail the Agenda 2063 master plan?
It exposes a massive vulnerability in the timelines, certainly, but the CISD analysis argues that these protests don't invalidate the dream of an integrated Africa. Instead, they serve as a harsh, unavoidable reality check.
Meaning they have to fix the local issues first.
Exactly. You cannot mandate aspirational, continent-wide mobility policies without first aggressively building the domestic capacity of the destination countries. Integration requires managed, sustainable mobility, not just throwing the floodgates open.
The chasm between the dream of a united, free-flowing African market and the reality of 34% unemployment just seems utterly uncrossable. But this is where the Center for AI and Sustainable Development pivots the narrative.
Yeah, this is the really fascinating part.
They don't just diagnose the political failure. They propose a very modern technological toolkit designed to bridge that exact chasm.
The CISD perspective is fundamentally pragmatic. Their core argument is that governments cannot solve economic grievances through populist scapegoating. You have to solve them through empirical data and evidence-based policy.
The report specifically highlights artificial intelligence. But how exactly does a line of code or an AI model fix a physical border crisis or create a job for a guy standing on a corner in Pretoria? What is the actual mechanism here?
The mechanism is visibility. Because the informal economy operates entirely in the shadows, traditional government statistics struggle to track day labor, unregistered street vendors, or small-scale cross-border trading.
Yeah, sell off the books.
Exactly. But AI models can analyze massive alternative data sets, things like mobile money transactions, localized supply chain movements, anonymized transit data to map that shadow economy in real time.
So instead of a government just guessing where the jobs are, or a community reacting out of a generalized fear that foreigners are stealing all the work, the technology can pinpoint exactly what economic gaps exist in a specific neighborhood.
Exactly that. It enables hyper-specific skills matching. And this perfectly aligns with the SEDC's goal of orderly labor migration.
Oh, see how that connects.
Yeah, if the data reveals that a specific region in South Africa has a critical deficit in, say, small-scale agricultural logistics or informal tech repair skills, the government can tailor its migration management to legally import those very specific skills.
You change the entire dynamic. Instead of an undocumented migrant crossing the border to fiercely compete with a desperate citizen for the exact same day labor job, the migrant is legally brought in to fill a calculated gap.
Right. They provide a service the community actually lacks, which then stimulates that local microeconomy.
By utilizing data to manage the flow of people, a government can mathematically demonstrate to its citizens that migration is functioning as a net positive.
Exactly. It removes the emotion and the terror from the lifeboat. You transition the public narrative from a zero-sum game of survival into a model of collaborative economic expansion.
I mean, that sounds like a brilliant, elegant solution on a whiteboard in a tech hub. But implementing that requires an astronomical level of political will, lack of corruption, and digital infrastructure that many of these departments currently just lack.
Oh, it is an incredibly steep hill to climb. There's no denying that. But as the CISD report implies, leveraging sustainable technology for evidence-based governance might be the only viable mechanism left.
Yeah.
It is the only path that respects the human rights mandated by the Constitution while simultaneously acknowledging the brutal economic realities on the street.
We have mapped out a tremendously complex landscape today. Let's distill the core of what we've uncovered. The events of June 30th, 2026. The 15,000 people marching in Durban, the unofficial deadlines, the 600 million rand spent on containment, the 900 arrests. None of these were isolated incidents of random public anger.
Not at all.
They were the unavoidable symptoms of a structural collision. You have an economy suffocating under 34% unemployment, operating under one of the most legally inclusive constitutions on earth, all while the broader continent is desperately trying to execute a massive, borderless integration plan.
And the state institutions held the line on Tuesday. They prevented the kind of mass tragedies we saw in 2008 and 2021. But a police line is temporary. The structural pressures that forced those 15,000 people out of their homes and into the streets, they are still there, just simmering.
And that is precisely why this deep dive matters to you, the listener, regardless of where you are in the world. Whether you are living in Johannesburg, London, or Tokyo, the challenge of balancing local economic scarcity with the unstoppable momentum of global or regional integration is the defining geopolitical puzzle of our time.
Yeah, every major industrialized economy will face some version of this lifeboat scenario in the coming decades. South Africa is just experiencing the acute edge of it right now.
Which brings us to one final, truly staggering thought, pulled from the broader implications of the source material. We've used the lifeboat analogy to describe the pressure of today's demographics. But consider the horizon. Demographers project that the continent of Africa will have a population of roughly 5 billion people by the year 2050.
5 billion individuals, all requiring food, housing, mobility, and economic opportunity.
If the aspirational ideals of a united, borderless African market are already cracking today under the pressure of current economic realities, what happens when that population multiplies exponentially?
It's a daunting question.
Can technology, AI, and proactive governance evolve fast enough to safely manage a continent of 5 billion moving people? Or will the lifeboats simply lock down, barricade their borders, and close their hatches entirely? Let that sink in.